Gunpowder smoke rose from the ruins of Coso Street as Sergeant Manuel Alcántara adjusted the sight of his rifled musket against the shattered windowsill. 300 meters away, a French officer gestured arrogantly, pointing toward Spanish positions with his unsheathed saber. The man didn't know he was signing his own death warrant. Manuel exhaled slowly, squeezed the trigger, and the rifled bullet spiraled from the barrel with a deadly whistle. The officer fell instantly, and astonishment rippled through the French lines like an electric shock. It was July 3, 1808, and Zaragoza was teaching the Grande Armée a lesson they would never forget: the arrogance of empire. 3 weeks earlier, General Jean-Antoine Verdier had observed Zaragoza's defenses with a mocking smile. His officers clustered around telescopes, pointing at the medieval walls and improvised fortifications with evident disdain. "Peasants with rusty muskets," Colonel Lacoste commented as he stowed his spyglass. "We'll take the city in 2 days, perhaps 3 if the Spaniards decide to be especially stubborn." The French generals had conquered half of Europe with the precision of a perfect military machine. They had humiliated Prussians and Austrians, subjugated Italians and Dutch. What could a provincial Spanish city do against the most powerful army on the continent? The arrogance intensified when French scouts reported on Spanish armament. "Rifled muskets," a lieutenant reported with a barely contained laugh. "The Spaniards believe those medieval relics will make any difference." Barrel rifling was an ancient technology that carved helical grooves inside the tube, making the bullet spin and dramatically increasing its accuracy and range. But it was an expensive process, slow to manufacture, and French smoothbore muskets could fire faster. French military doctrine privileged volume of fire over precision, massive infantry charges over selective shooting. The generals considered rifled muskets as quaint curiosities, weapons for hunters and isolated sharpshooters, not for modern warfare of closed formations and fixed bayonets. What the French didn't know was that Zaragoza was no ordinary Spanish city. A city forged in fire. Capital of Aragon, Zaragoza was forged during centuries of resistance against Moorish invaders, and its population retained a particular fierceness. When José de Palafox and Melzi, a young Aragonese noble turned resistance leader, issued his famous war cry, "War to the knife," he wasn't using a metaphor. Local factories have been producing rifled muskets for months, taking advantage of Aragonese artisanal tradition. Each weapon was a masterpiece, individually calibrated, with barrels that could hit targets at 400 meters with deadly precision. Zaragoza's gunsmiths had perfected techniques passed down since the time of the Catholic monarchs. The forces converging on Zaragoza represented a clash of military philosophies. General Verdier's French army numbered approximately 13,000 men, veterans hardened by Italian and German campaigns, equipped with Charleville flintlock muskets, heavy field artillery, and the unshakable confidence of those who had conquered empires. Their strategy was direct: massive bombardment, coordinated assault, rapid occupation. They had perfected this formula in dozens of European cities. On the other side of the walls, Palafox had assembled a heterogeneous force of barely 9,000 defenders, regular soldiers from the Extremadura Regimiento, urban militias, peasant volunteers, and hundreds of civilians armed with anything that could kill a Frenchman. But they had something the French hadn't considered. Every 5th man carried a rifled musket, and all were willing to die for every inch of their city. The first blood. On June 15, 1808, when the first French columns marched confidently toward the walls, they expected a quick capitulation. Tricolor flags waved proudly while drums marked the pace. Verdier sent a foreman ultimatum: immediate surrender or total destruction. Palafox's response echoed from the battlements with crystal clarity that froze French blood: war to the knife. The French officers exchanged bewildered looks. These provincials really believed they could resist? The artillery bombardment began that same afternoon. French 12-pounder cannons opened fire against the walls, and the roar of artillery shook the city's foundations. But when the dust settled and the first assault columns advanced, something unexpected happened. Spanish marksmen with rifled muskets opened fire from the walls, and French officers began falling with precision that defied all known military logic. At distances where smoothbore muskets barely reached effectively, Spanish bullets found their targets with surgical accuracy. Sergeants fell, captains collapsed, and panic began seeping through the French ranks. What kind of witchcraft was this? Veterans of Austerlitz and Jena had faced death 1,000 times, but never like this, never with this relentless precision that turned every exposure into a death sentence. What should have been a triumphal march was turning into a nightmare of selective fire. And this was only the beginning of the bloodiest and most surprising siege of the entire Spanish War of Independence.
The science of defense. Palafox's defensive planning had begun weeks before the first French shot. The 33-year-old general knew he couldn't win a conventional battle against the Napoleonic army, but Zaragoza wouldn't be a conventional battle. He gathered his officers in the Archbishop's palace on the night of May 24th, spreading detailed maps of every street, every square, every convent in the city. "We'll turn every house into a fortification," he declared, pointing to strategic points. "The French may have more cannons, but we know every stone of this city." Santiago Sauci Flores, a brilliant artillery officer, proposed a bold strategy: distribute the rifled muskets among select marksmen, trained specifically to eliminate enemy officers and gunners. It wasn't about stopping the French advance with volume of fire, but decapitating their chain of command with surgical precision. The preparations transformed Zaragoza into a deadly labyrinth. Wide streets were blocked with stone and packed earth barricades. Corner buildings were converted into sniper nests with carefully calculated firing positions to create crossfire zones. In convents and monasteries, monks worked alongside soldiers, reinforcing walls and storing ammunition. The Santa Engracia convent was transformed into a fortified bastion, its thick walls capable of withstanding prolonged bombardments. The women of Zaragoza, refusing to be mere spectators, organized supply brigades and field hospitals. Among them stood a young woman named Agustina Raimunda Maria Zaragoza Domenech, who would soon become legend as Agustina of Aragon. No one imagined then that this 24-year-old woman would change the course of entire battles. The marksmen. Manuel Alcántara, a former Pyrenees hunter turned sergeant, led the training of select marksmen. He had spent 20 years tracking deer and wild boar in the mountains, where a single shot had to count. Now he taught those skills to men who had never fired beyond 50 meters. "The rifled musket doesn't forgive mistakes," he explained, while adjusting a nervous peasant's posture, "but it also doesn't forgive whoever is in your sights." Ammunition presented a constant challenge. Each bullet for a rifled musket had to be cast with millimetric precision to fit perfectly into the barrel grooves. Zaragoza's foundries worked day and night, with veteran craftsmen supervising each batch. Lead was heated in crucibles until it glowed with a reddish brilliance, then poured into iron molds cooled with Ebro River water. Each bullet was individually inspected. A single imperfection could jam the weapon at the critical moment. Pedro Villacampa, a third-generation gunsmith, explained to soldiers how to clean the barrel grooves after each shot. "Gunpowder leaves residue," he warned with severity. "Fire 10 times without cleaning, and your weapon will be as useful as a stick." Soldiers learned to carry cleaning rods and oiled rags as if they were sacred relics. The killing ground. The first real contact with the enemy came on June 15th at 4 p.m. French advance guards appeared on the horizon like a dark blue line extending as far as the eye could see. Drums played the approach march, a constant rhythm that had preceded the fall of Vienna, Berlin, and a dozen other capitals. On Zaragoza's walls, defenders watched in silence as that human tide approached. Some prayed, others checked their weapons for the 10th time. Many simply stared forward with clenched jaws. Manuel moved among his marksmen, verifying positions, adjusting shooting angles. "Wait for my signal," he repeated calmly. "Let them approach. We want clear targets, not distant shadows." At 200 meters, they could see the individual faces of French soldiers, some very young, others weathered by years of campaigning.
The battle's initial development caught the French completely unprepared. When Verdier ordered the first exploratory assault, he expected the typical disorganized resistance of local militias. His columns advanced in closed formation, muskets ready, officers in front leading by example. At 150 meters from the walls, Manuel gave the order, "Fire at will." The crack of rifled muskets sounded different from the massive roar of musket volleys, more spaced, more deliberate, almost methodical, but the effects were devastating. The first French lieutenant fell with a bullet in his chest. 3 seconds later, a captain collapsed with his throat destroyed. A sergeant shouting orders was silenced mid-sentence. French officers fell like chess pieces being removed from the board, and formations began to waver without their leaders. Confusion in French ranks quickly transformed into panic. Common soldiers looked around seeking orders that didn't come because their superiors lay dead or dying. Some tried to return fire, but their smoothbore muskets barely reached the walls effectively. French bullets struck the ancient stone, creating dust clouds, but rarely found flesh. In contrast, every Spanish shot seemed to be guided by an invisible hand, finding gaps in defenses, penetrating uniforms, dropping men.
The legend of Agustina. As the siege intensified, Palafox made decisions that defined the unique character of the defense. Against the advice of some conservative officers, he authorized weapon distribution to civilians, including women. "Every Zaragozan who can hold a weapon is a soldier," he declared at a war council meeting. This decision democratized resistance and transformed the entire city into a living fortress. Children ran ammunition, elderly men loaded muskets, women fired from windows. Agustina of Aragon, who had been carrying water and food to defenders, witnessed the moment that would make her legend. A Spanish battery at the Portillo Gate had been decimated by French counter-battery fire. The gunners lay dead or wounded, and the cannons fell silent. The French, seeing the opportunity, launched an immediate assault. Agustina, a petite woman barely 5 feet tall, dropped her water jugs and ran toward the abandoned cannon. Before anyone could react, she had loaded the cannon with efficiency that astonished witnesses. She had watched the gunners for days, memorizing every movement. She aimed at the nearest French column, now barely 100 meters away, and applied the ignition fuse. The cannon roared, recoiling violently, and grape shot shredded the assault's vanguard. Soldiers who, seconds before, were running confidently, now lay dismembered or fled in terror. Agustina reloaded, fired again, then a third time before other defenders arrived to help. Her active courage inspired the entire city. Palafox immediately promoted her to artillery sub-lieutenant, making her the first female officer in the Spanish army. Her image, a defiant woman beside a smoking cannon, would be reproduced in engravings circulating throughout Spain, inspiring resistance in every corner of the country. The precision of death. The crucial moment arrived in mid-July when Verdier, frustrated by weeks of failures, ordered a massive general assault. He concentrated all his artillery on a 200-meter section of wall near Santo Engracia convent. For 2 entire days, cannons hammered that section until reducing it to rubble. On July 2nd, the breach seemed large enough. Verdier assembled 3,000 elite soldiers, veterans of Austerlitz, for the assault. "Don't stop until you're inside the city," he ordered his colonels. "And once inside, take it building by building if necessary." Drums sounded the advance, and the dark blue tide moved toward the breach. It seemed unstoppable. But Manuel and his marksmen were waiting, and the rifled muskets were ready to speak again. The French column advanced toward the breach with a discipline that only years of victories could forge. 3,000 veterans marched shoulder to shoulder, their blue uniforms stained with dust but their formations impeccable. Imperial Guard grenadiers went in front, the tallest and fiercest men in Napoleon's army, with their distinctive bearskin caps and waxed mustaches. Behind came the voltigeurs, light infantry trained for urban combat. Martial music from military bands competed with the thunder of drums. From a distance, it seemed an irresistible force, a tide that would drown any resistance. French officers smiled with confidence. Finally, they thought this farce would end. But they didn't know what awaited them in Santa Engracia's smoking ruins. The meat grinder. The battle's dynamic changed the instant the first French soldiers crossed the breach. What they expected to find was a terrorized city, demoralized defenders retreating in panic. What they found was a meticulously prepared hell. Every building around the breach had been converted into an independent fortification, with marksmen posted at every window, every door blocked except those necessary for counterattacks. Streets were blocked with barricades that channeled attackers into carefully delimited death zones. And from every elevated position, rifled muskets opened fire with precision that turned every intersection into a grave. The grenadiers, accustomed to breaking enemy lines with their mere presence, fell like wheat under the scythe. Their officers, so conspicuous with their elaborate uniforms, were priority targets. In 15 minutes, the French army's elite was trapped in a deadly labyrinth. Santiago Sess, the brilliant artillery officer, had positioned small field cannons on upper floors of strategic buildings. When French columns compacted in narrow streets, these cannons opened fire at point-blank range with grape shot. Walnut-sized iron balls bounced between stone walls, multiplying their lethal effect. The French tried to retreat, but found more fire from their rear, where other defenders had closed the trap. Manuel Alcántara personally directed a group of select marksmen from the convent itself. His rifled musket sang death every 20 seconds. A lieutenant trying to reorganize his men, a sergeant pointing out an escape route, a bugler about to sound retreat. Each shot was calculated, deliberate, lethal. Don't waste bullets on common soldiers. Look for the golden epaulets. Without leaders, they're a mob. Blood and iron. Individual heroism manifested in forms that defied imagination. A group of 20 French soldiers managed to penetrate to the Pilar Plaza, Zaragoza's spiritual heart. There they found themselves face to face with a group of defenders that included Agustina of Aragon. The woman who had saved a battery days before now led a counterattack with saber in hand, a weapon she barely knew how to use, but wielded with maternal ferocity, protecting her city. "For Zaragoza and the Virgin of Pilar," she shouted as she charged. Her courage galvanized the men around her. The French, exhausted and demoralized, surrendered to the impossibility of continuing. But the most extraordinary act occurred in the ruins of a house near the breach, where an elderly priest named Father Basilio continued firing his rifled musket even after being gravely wounded. When French soldiers finally reached him, they found a 70-year-old man with 3 bullet wounds who had killed 8 enemy soldiers. They respected him so much, they took him to a French hospital where surgeons fought to save his life.
The breaking point. The immediate consequences of the failed assault were devastating for the French. Of the 3,000 men who entered the breach, fewer than 1,800 returned unharmed. The casualties weren't just numerical, but moral. Veterans of Austerlitz, men who had seen and survived the most terrible hells of Napoleonic war, were visibly shaken. Their faces showed something rarely seen in French soldiers: doubt. A captain was heard murmuring, "They're not human. They cannot be defeated." Officers tried to maintain discipline, but fear of the rifled muskets had installed itself deeply. Soldiers began using the term "the rifles of the devil" when speaking of Spanish weapons. Verdier faced a command crisis. He had lost almost a third of his elite force in a single day, and his troops' morale was crumbling. Worse still, news of the disaster was spreading throughout Spain. Every French defeat inspired new rebellions in other provinces. The general wrote to his superiors requesting urgent reinforcements, but his reports were received with incredulity in Paris. How could an imperial army be defeated by urban militias? Napoleon, reading the dispatches, ordered more troops sent, but also an investigation into Verdier's competence. The Grande Armée's pride was at stake. If Zaragoza could resist, what message did that send to the rest of Europe? Austria and Prussia, barely subdued, might rebel again. The stubborn Spanish city had become a symbol, much larger than its strategic military importance. The final hours. The first siege's most intense moment came on August 4, 1808, when Verdier launched his last and most desperate assault. During the night, he had concentrated all his remaining artillery in a bombardment that turned the night sky into an orange hell of explosions. Incendiary projectiles illuminated Zaragoza with an apocalyptic glow, while flames devoured entire buildings. The heat was so intense that defenders on nearby walls had to retreat or risk being roasted alive. Church bells melted, producing distorted, ghostly notes. But even as the city burned, the marksmen with rifled muskets maintained their positions. Pedro Villacampa, his face blackened by soot, continued firing from the Seo tower even when the wooden beams underneath creaked threateningly. "I'll leave the tower when it falls and not a second before," he had said. At dawn, 8,000 French soldiers, all of Verdier's available effectives, advanced on a 1-kilometer front. This time there was no tactical elegance, only brute force and desperation. The general had received an ultimatum from his superiors: take Zaragoza immediately or be relieved of command in disgrace. The battle's combat was the bloodiest of the entire siege. The French managed to establish bridgeheads at 3 different points of the defenses. In the northern sector, they penetrated to Alfonso Street, barely 200 meters from the city center. There, Agustina of Aragon personally organized a counteroffensive that would become legend. With a saber in one hand and a pistol in the other, she led 50 volunteers in a suicidal charge against a fortified French position. "For Spain and for freedom," she shouted as she ran directly toward enemy fire. The French, astonished to see a woman leading the attack, hesitated a crucial instant. That instant was enough. The Spaniards fell upon them with a fury that admitted no quarter. Hand-to-hand combat was brutal and primitive. Bayonets, knives, rifle butts, bare hands. When it ended, the French position had been retaken, but at a terrible cost. Half the Spanish attackers lay dead or wounded, but the line had been restored. The battle's outcome was finally decided not by individual heroism, but by implacable mathematics. Verdier had gambled everything on this assault, and when by mid-afternoon it became clear he couldn't hold the positions gained, he had no reserves for another attempt. His losses were unsustainable. More than 2,000 dead and wounded in a single day. Where still, French supply lines were being attacked by Spanish guerrillas emerging like ghosts from the surrounding countryside. Without reinforcements, without sufficient ammunition, and facing an enemy that simply refused to be defeated, the general made the most humiliating decision of his career. At 6 p.m. on August 14, 1808, he ordered a general retreat. Imperial French flags that had waved victoriously over dozens of European capitals were retreating, defeated, before a provincial Spanish city. It was inconceivable, but it was real. Echoes across Europe. The strategic consequences resonated like an earthquake throughout Europe. Zaragoza had resisted 2 complete months against the continent's most powerful army. More importantly, it had demonstrated that the French could be defeated, that their supposed invincibility was myth. In Austria, generals studied the reports with renewed interest. In Prussia, military reformers began considering adopting rifled muskets for their own troops. Throughout Spain, Zaragoza's example ignited resistance. If one city could resist, perhaps the entire nation could liberate itself. Guerrillas multiplied, uprisings exploded in provinces the French believed pacified. The Spanish War of Independence that Napoleon had imagined as a brief campaign would become the Spanish ulcer that would bleed his empire for 6 more years. The Spanish victory was not without cost. Zaragoza was devastated. A third of buildings destroyed, thousands of civilians dead, the economy in ruins, food reserves exhausted, ammunition almost completely consumed.
If Verdier could have resisted one more week, perhaps the result would have been different. But war is as much about will as resources, and Zaragoza's will had proven unbreakable. The technology that changed warfare. The rifled muskets, initially mocked by French generals as obsolete relics, had rewritten military tactic books. Precision had triumphed over volume of fire, quality over quantity. It was a lesson that European armies would take decades to learn completely, but Zaragoza had taught it with blood and gunpowder. The effectiveness of rifled muskets demonstrated in the siege accelerated their adoption in European armies. By the 1850s, most military powers were replacing their smoothbore muskets with rifled rifles, a transition that would fundamentally change the nature of warfare. The Crimean War and American Civil War would show the full impact of this technology at industrial scale. Tactics also evolved. The closed infantry formations that had dominated Napoleonic wars were gradually abandoned in favor of more dispersed tactics and use of cover, precisely the lessons the French had learned painfully in Zaragoza. Urban defense concepts were also extensively studied. Prussian and Austrian military manuals of the period included entire chapters analyzing how Palafox had converted a city into an integral fortress. Legacy of heroes. The siege's memory was meticulously preserved by Zaragozanos. The Siege Museum, established in 1908 to commemorate the centenary, houses an extraordinary collection of artifacts, original rifled muskets with their hand-carved barrels, uniforms pierced by bullets, letters from soldiers written hours before dying, and reconstructions of urban defenses. One of the most moving objects is Manuel Alcántara's rifled musket, donated by his descendants. The weapon shows marks of extensive use, with the barrel slightly worn by countless cleanings. Next to the weapon is a diary where Manuel meticulously recorded each successful shot during the siege. 237 entries, each marking an enemy soldier's life. It's not pleasant reading, but it's unfiltered history, testimony of what war really means beyond heroic narratives. Monuments dedicated to the siege dot the entire city. The most impressive is the monument to the sieges in España Plaza, inaugurated in 1908, showing heroic-sized sculptures of defenders in full battle. Agustina of Aragon has her own statue, portrayed with one foot on a cannon, looking defiantly toward the horizon. Every year on July 2nd, Zaragoza commemorates the first siege's beginning, with ceremonies that combine military solemnity and popular celebration. Current Spanish Army veterans march through the same street where their ancestors fought, and local schoolchildren learned about Palafox, Agustina, and the rifled muskets as a fundamental part of their Aragonese identity. The Second Siege. However, Zaragoza's story didn't end with Verdier's retreat in August 1808. Napoleon, enraged by the humiliation, personally ordered a second siege with massively superior forces. In December 1808, 50,000 French soldiers under Marshal Lannes surrounded the city again. This time, they came prepared for the rifled musket, using more dispersed formations, attacking mainly at night,
employing their own sharpshooters and heavy artillery in quantities that made the first siege seem like a rehearsal. The second siege would last 2 months of absolute horror, with house-to-house, street-to-street combat. Diseases, particularly typhus, would kill more defenders than French bullets. When Zaragoza finally capitulated on February 20th, 1809, it had lost more than half its population. But even in defeat, it had proven its point. The Spanish would never surrender voluntarily, and every French victory would have a price in blood that eventually the empire couldn't pay. The deepest legacy. Perhaps the Siege of Zaragoza's deepest legacy is its demonstration that military technology alone doesn't decide wars. The rifled muskets gave the Spanish a crucial tactical advantage, but what really made the difference was the unshakable will of a people fighting on their own land for their freedom. The French had numerical superiority, better training, more resources, and a seemingly endless tradition of victories. The Spanish had homes to defend, families to protect, and determination born of desperation. This combination of appropriate technology and absolute motivation proved more powerful than any French material advantage. It's a lesson that has repeated in subsequent conflicts, in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, and every place where a technologically superior invader faced determined defenders with intimate knowledge of terrain and existential reasons to resist. Remembrance. The modern study of the siege has benefited enormously from the opening of French and Spanish military archives. Historians can now reconstruct the battle with almost minute-by-minute detail, comparing accounts from both sides to obtain a complete picture. What emerges is more nuanced than traditional heroic narratives, but also more fascinating. The French weren't monsters, but professional soldiers following orders in a war many didn't completely understand. The Spanish weren't superheroes, but ordinary people forced to do extraordinary things. The rifled muskets were effective but not magical, requiring training, maintenance, and above all, marksmen with nerves of steel capable of firing with precision while enemy projectiles whistled around them. The final reflection on Zaragoza must recognize both triumph and cost. The city resisted gloriously, and in doing so inspired a nation to continue the fight for its independence. The rifled muskets demonstrated their value and changed military thinking forever. Heroes like Palafox, Agustina, and Manuel deserve to be remembered. But we must also remember the thousands of civilians who died, the shattered families, the city reduced to rubble. War, even when just and necessary, always exacts a terrible price. The rifled barrels of Zaragoza wrote their name in history with fire and blood, teaching the world that precision can defeat brute force, that determination can overcome tyranny, but also that victory always carries scars that never completely heal. 2 centuries later, Zaragoza's rebuilt walls stand silent testament to when a Spanish city refused to kneel and its rifled muskets spoke with precision that made an empire tremble.